Good morning, everyone. And I have to say that I am very honored to be back. First of all, this is my second Movement is Life caucus, but it is so clear that the people in this room already know so much and already care so much. So I'm going to be sharing with you some communication tools. Perhaps they'll teach you something, or perhaps they'll just provide you with an easy way to convey what you already know to your colleagues and to your communities. I actually modified the title that appears in your program, which is Dismantling Racism in Health, and I put the care in brackets, recognizing that all of us are here because we're interested in the care of people who have, musculoskeletal and joint issues. But when we're talking about racism, the dismantling is actually going to have to go far beyond the healthcare system. And to help you understand what I mean there, I'm going to share with you my first tool, which is what I call my cliff analogy, which is to help us understand how even we, as people interested in the healthcare enterprise, must name racism if we're going to have any success in our work. And so this will be to help us understand many different levels of health intervention. So here we go. Whoops! Boom! Somebody just fell off of the cliff of good health. And if that were you or somebody in your family, you would be delighted to find an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff to speed you on to care. But if we were concerned about other people who might come along that cliff, so if we were concerned about population health or public health or community health, we might well ask ourselves, what could we put in place as a health intervention besides just stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? So somebody in the room is going to say, I know, let's put a net halfway down because we recognize people will fall, but at least we can catch them before they get crunched up at the bottom. So that is an excellent idea. But nets do have holes in them, and so some people might fall through the cracks. But never mind that. Let's make it a trampoline halfway down. No holes in a trampoline. But even if we have a trampoline halfway down that cliff, we might well find ourselves with lots of people just bouncing up and down at half functionality, not able to get back to the top of the cliff. So what else could we put in place as a health intervention? Well, clearly we need to be thinking about putting a fence at the edge of the cliff to keep people from falling in the first place. But even that fence has to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else could we do as a health intervention? Well, we need to be thinking about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. So let me label the interventions that I've depicted so far, where the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff clearly represents medical care, as well as what we in public health describe as tertiary prevention. So in public health, we talk about 3 levels of prevention: primary, secondary, tertiary, where tertiary prevention is preventing complications from disease that's already manifest. So, for example, preventing amputations from diabetes or the like. So the ambulance, medical care or tertiary prevention. The safety, net or trampoline halfway down, these are our safety net programs, which are often found in our social services, as well as secondary prevention, which is early detection, screening. The fence at the edge of the cliff represents primary prevention, keeping bad things from happening in the first place, and moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is about addressing what we, on the public health side of things at least, describe as the social determinants of health. So these are the determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual. They are beyond our individual genes and also beyond our individual behaviors. And they include the context of our lives, in fact, the context in which our behaviors arise and either convey risk or protection. And that context could be individual context, like individual occupation or income or education or wealth. And so addressing poverty is a very clear way of addressing an adverse social determinant of health. But they also include neighborhood context. So can you exercise in your neighborhood? Can you walk 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week? In your neighborhood? Are there even sidewalks or streetlights? What is the relationship of police officers to people walking in your neighborhood? Are there jobs in your neighborhood? And even if there isn't a job, is there transportation to a job? What is the quality of housing, of education, and the like? So addressing adverse neighborhood conditions is another way of addressing social determinants of health. And even occupational hazards or opportunity structures like the quality of the schools, all of that is in that social determinants of health category. Usually I use an example when I'm trying to illustrate how with a single outcome we could understand these different levels. I often go to infant mortality. If we are trying to think about addressing infant mortality, what would the ambulance be and the net, et cetera? So the ambulance would be our neonatal intensive care units. The net might be prenatal care, which is about screening pregnant women for problems in pregnancy before they become big problems in pregnancy. The fence might be excellent maternal nutrition, so maybe our women, infants, children, our WIC programs. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff might be excellent educational opportunities, so young girls don't have babies so soon. Or maybe it would be a living wage, so that pregnant women aren't living in poverty. But let's put musculoskeletal and arthritis outcomes on there. So I guess the ambulance might be that knee replacement. The net, I don't know how much you want to have in primary care settings screening for joint pain. I don't know if that's like part of the program, but that kind of early detection and screening and getting people to appropriate services before the problem becomes bad, or maybe screening and then promoting movement. But I would clearly think that movement is life. That would be that fence, promoting active movement. But then that's still at the individual level. Moving the population away from the edge of the cliff gets back to having healthy neighborhoods with healthy food choices so that you are not living in a food desert or what some people describe as a fast food swamp. Healthy neighborhoods, and all of that. So this is a nice little diagram. We could put lots of outcomes on that. We could go into a community and say, how should we be spending our health resources? We know we need some of all of that. We want that ambulance, right? But we also need to be moving the population away. We could use this diagram with Congress to talk about health expenditures, but as useful as it is, it has a huge fatal flaw, as I've presented it so far. And the huge fatal flaw is that it does not yet equip us to talk about how health disparities arise. So I want you to keep this cliff in the back of your mind. We're going to shift gears for just a minute to talk about how health disparities arise, and then we'll come back to the cliff. So how do health disparities arise? Well, especially, especially when we're talking about racial ethnic health disparities, which have a very long history in our nation and occur across age groups and across organ systems and the like. We unfortunately have lots of evidence about differences in the quality of care received within the healthcare system, even if you're in the same system. I mean, we had so many testimonials to that right now, but even if you're about differences in terms of how systems treat people, but even with everybody in the same hospital system or everybody under Medicare or Medicaid or in the VA system. The Institute of Medicine in 2002 released its unequal treatment report, which pulled together what were then hundreds of studies documenting, for example, differences in how vigorously your chest pain might be investigated or treated depending on your race, or differences in how much pain medication you might get if you walked into an emergency department with a long bone fracture depending on your ethnicity. So that IOM panel shone the bright light of inquiry on the question, are we as providers? It wasn't said, but I'm a family physician as well as a PhD epidemiologist. So I am no longer seeing patients, but I am, trained clinically. And for us, on the clinical side of things, it sent a lightning bolt through the profession. How could this be that we're providing care differentially within our system? It's important, though, to ask those questions, and it's important to recognize that this is real. But even the IOM panel said that is not the only way at which health disparities arise because, of course, there are many people who cannot access health care in the first place. That's a second level at which health disparities arise. But I'm hoping that all of us in this room now recognize that health is not created within the health sector. So there's a third level at which health disparities arise, which are the differences in the conditions of our lives. Differences in our underlying exposures, opportunities, and stresses, which are making some individuals and communities sicker than others in the first place. And when you think about these three levels at which health disparities arise, differences in quality of care, differences in access to care, and differences in underlying exposures and opportunities, you could draw it as a pyramid with the huge base. In fact, let's think of it as an iceberg where the huge hidden base are the differences in the conditions of our lives. And then very often the same people who have been made sicker are frustrated because of limited access to the healthcare system And then sometimes, even the lucky ones who get into the system are sometimes further injured because of differences in quality of care. So now we're going to go back to the cliff, thinking about these three levels at which health disparities arise: differences in quality care, differences in access to care, differences in underlying exposures and opportunities. But now we're going to recognize that we're really not dealing with a flat, two-dimensional cliff, but actually we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there might be an ambulance there, but maybe that ambulance has a flat tire, so it's slow or goes off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all. And maybe there's no net, nor fence. And usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is being pushed closer to the edge. So now I want to label these observations about the three-dimensional cliff with how health disparities arise, where the differences in quality of care are represented when there's an ambulance there, but it's slow or goes off in the wrong direction. Differences in access to care are no ambulance, no net, no fence, and differences in underlying exposures and opportunities are represented by the closer proximity of that greeny population to the edge. So now that we recognize that we're really dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, there's a whole new set of questions that arise. The first question, of course, is how did that cliff become three-dimensional in the first place? And that's usually because of historical injustices that are perpetuated by present-day contemporary structural factors. But given that we are dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, we also need to ask, why are the resources differentially distributed along this cliff face? And why are different populations found at different parts of the cliff? Why are the greenies being pushed closer to the edge while the oranges are way back and away? And when we start asking and addressing these kinds of questions, we are now doing something that differs from addressing the social determinants of health, like poverty and adverse neighborhood conditions and the like. I described that as moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. When we start asking about the distribution of resources and populations along a three-dimensional cliff, we are now addressing the social determinants of equity, which include racism, sexism, heterosexism, economic systems like capitalism and the like, systems of power that can distribute resources and populations. And actually, along this cliff, I have distilled, if you will, three different dimensions of health intervention, where if you go back to your junior high or high school geometry, one dimension is a line, 2 dimensions is a flat plane, 3 dimensions is space. Well, it's along the line at the edge of the cliff that we can display all of our health services, our curative and preventive health services, that ambulance, net, and fence, right up there along the edge of the cliff. And even, the Affordable Care Act conversation is an edge of the cliff conversation, but even a conversation about finally joining the rest of the developed world and having universal access to high-quality health care, even that will still be an edge-of-the-cliff conversation, right? The reason we must insist on universal access to high-quality health care is because that is how a civilized society values all of its people equally. But even when we get there, which we must, that still, any system can be overwhelmed if everybody's pushed up against the edge of it. So that, in and of itself, will not necessarily result in large and sustained improvements in health outcomes or the elimination of health disparities. We must move into the second dimension, which I can display in a flat plane. We must be about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, addressing poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, and the like, addressing these social determinants of health, if we want large and sustained improvements in health outcomes. But the trick there is that if we're about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff without recognizing that we're really dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, we are at risk of moving some of the population, but not all of the population, and actually making health disparities worse. So we must acknowledge and address the three-dimensionality of the cliff. And so we have to be naming and addressing racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, and the like, if we want to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities. Now, often, I will stop here and take people's questions. So I'm going to stop here and take one question, because I only have 45 minutes, and I have two other big stories or images I want to share with you, and some other things. But I would like to hear at least one or two questions or comments about this model. You can shout them out. And are we taping this? Yes. Okay, so I'll repeat the question. You don't have to run to a mic. Is there anything? No questions, no comments. Did you understand me? Yes. Okay. Well, so then I'm going to tell you some questions or comments that other people have asked in the past. Okay. One. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I'm wondering how do you? It seems like you need to get a lot of people in the room to talk about different aspects of our community and resources, whether it's schools.
Actually, why don't you go to a mic? Because this is a lovely question, and since we're taping it, it would be very wonderful. Yes.
So my question relates to how do we get all those facets of the community together? It's not just about health and healthcare. It seems to be about schools and finances and environmental health and all those things that come together under social determinants of health, but just things that make a healthy community, whether it's food resources in our community. How do we get all those people at the table and speaking together and working together to achieve this
This
dynamic?
understanding. So that's a very good question. Sometimes we may not get everybody in the room at the same time, but we need to have everybody recognizing that their work is part of a bigger thing. So we need the orthopedic surgeons at the bottom of the cliff replacing knees and hips and that kind of thing. We need these excellent ambulance drivers. But as you are there, instead of just being so involved in scooping people up and rushing them to care, you need to be asking, is there a net above me? And how strong is that net? And how can I strengthen that net? Is there a fence? How close is the population to the edge? And actually, at what part of the cliff am I operating and working? And am I at the, am I where the greatest need is or whatever? So we need people working at various levels. But first of all, they need to understand the importance of the other levels around them in the whole system. And then when you are outside of your day job, that's when I encourage all of us to be interested in the three-dimensionality of the cliff first, in the equity piece, right? And so you can, as a physician, for example, bring your knowledge and your expertise and all of the respect that you have in the community to a city council meeting or to Congress, or get involved, in writing legislation or promulgating rules and all, which belie an understanding of the complexity of this, that it is not just a healthcare issue, right? So what I'm requiring not necessarily is that everybody be in the room at the same time. It's important that we try to get in different rooms with our different understandings, but we have to understand that that my netness is not the end-all and be-all. And that I need the ambulance below me, and I need to be working with that fence, and I need to be moving the population, and I especially need to be acknowledging and addressing the three-dimensionality of the cliff. So often we are stuck in our bubbles right where we are working that we don't even venture down to even understand that there are people who are living in different circumstances, that there are people who are just as kind, funny, smart, generous, hardworking as we are, who are living just across town in very different circumstances, or working just across town in very different circumstances. And we need to create opportunities to experience our common humanity in different circumstances and start sharing understandings and resources and all the like. So thank you for that question. I will also say that I'm often asked, why do we as a society spend so much money on ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, right? Like, if this is true and if this makes sense, why don't we understand that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? So there are several answers to that. I guess maybe the most simplistic is that there's a lot of money being made down there in the ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. I mean, let's be real, by hospitals and even healthcare providers and device companies. Oh my God, what did I just say? And, and pharmaceutical companies and the like. No, so there's a lot of money being made there at the bottom of the cliff. But also, that emphasis belies one of what I consider three huge barriers to achieving health equity in our nation. One of those huge barriers is our very narrow focus on the individual. So we don't even understand that there's been a health issue until somebody's fallen off the edge of the cliff. We are not routinely measuring how close is the population to the edge. We could develop stronger measures of, even social cohesion or social networking or, income inequality. We could have aggregate measures that would be measuring that. We do not, right? And so there's that. And then another question I would say that I get asked is, why are the greenies just running and launching themselves over the edge? So this is like, why don't they change their diet, right? Why don't they eat better? Why don't they move more, right? And so here, there are two things. First of all, because we're so narrowly focused on the individual, it makes systems and structures either invisible or irrelevant, and we don't even see the hand that is pushing the greedy population closer to the edge. And also, the second huge barrier to achieving health equity that I've sort of distilled in my travels through this life is that we as a nation are ahistorical. Let me say that again, ahistorical. That is, we act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance, without understanding how the cliff became three-dimensional and what forces have positioned resources and populations the way we see them today. So anyway, I could go on and on about the cliff, but since just one person had a question, then we're going to carry on. And so what I'm going to say now is that often I do not pause at this point because I am with a more general audience, and all I say is, I've said the word racism 2 or 3 times, and nobody fell off their chair, so let's go. But I see one more question, so please approach a mic. Approach a mic, please.
I guess my main concern is the denial and the idea that there is no longer persistence of racial oppression, that slavery has somehow ended, and we're post-Jim Crow, et cetera,
Right.
and the denial about the persistence of racial oppression, to me, is, the big issue, the elephant in the room.
Thank you so much. And so thank you. I did not pay her to say that, but that is exactly the right. In this country, there are people who say, well, I recognize that racism was a thing of the past, but we're past that. After all, we did have a black president, right? Many people said that. And his election, President Barack Obama's election, represented a change in race relations enough to get him elected twice, right? But it did not dismantle the structures and all of racism. So I'm going to come now to defining racism, where when I say the word racism, I am clear that I'm talking about a system. I am not talking about an individual character flaw, nor a personal moral failing, nor even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. I'm talking about a system of power. And it's a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race in this country. Now, I won't beleaguer the point here, but I'm hoping that all of us recognize that race is not encoded in our genes, right? That we have mapped the human genome. There's no things, like racial subspeciation within the human genome. But just to give you an example of what I mean by race as the social interpretation of how one looks, here in DC, you look at me and I'm clearly black. If you were to look at me in some parts of Brazil, I would be just as clearly white. If you were to look at me in South Africa, I would be just as clearly colored. Here I am with the same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance in those 3 settings would assign me to 3 different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would probably become that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all 3 places. So that's what I mean by race, this social interpretation of how one looks, and racism is the system that operates on that race to both structure opportunity and assign value. What are the impacts of racism? Well, when we do, in this country, acknowledge that racism is still alive and well, in this widespread denial that it continues to exist and have profound impacts. But when we break through that, then we get to the point of understanding that racism is unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that is the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country, because it makes some people, especially some white people, uncomfortable. And when I said those words right now, it may have made some people in this room uncomfortable. And I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable, so if you're uncomfortable, I'm going to ask you to shake it off, okay? Really. Really, no. And I'm going to tell you a story in a minute that's going to make it even more clear what I'm talking about in this reciprocal advantage-disadvantage thing. But also, I've been thinking lately about how we have been valuing white comfort over truth for so long in this country, and I'm almost done with that, right? So, but let me just say one more thing. Even as we acknowledge that there's unfair disadvantage and unfair advantage, racism has one more huge impact, which is that it is sapping the strength of the whole society. through the waste of human resources. And there are many examples of that, but let me just lift up two very quickly. The first is that we as a nation are not yet vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our children. Because the blinders of racism, right? The blinders of racism have made many people think that there's no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those children. But of course, there's genius in all of our communities. And if we were to only vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even as a world. In fact, I often say we might already be up on Mars farming if that were a good idea. But then, you know, we wouldn't even have to go to Mars. If we were to invest in all that genius, we would be solving the problems in our communities today. A second example of how racism and these blinders that don't value all of us equally have sapped the strength of the whole society is how they have made us as a nation complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from human potential. And if you know folks who are stuck in the prisons or are cycling in and out, and I could talk to you about this for a long time, but I won't. But if you know any of these people, you know there are many geniuses caught up in the system that if there had only been some other way, could be contributing quite productively to our society. And so of all of these three impacts of racism, I actually think we need to be spending more time lifting up that third point about how racism is sapping the strength of all of us. We need more media stories on that. We need more data collection on that point. We even need more conversations around our dinner tables so that we can have more people filled with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. Before I leave this slide, there's one more thing I want to say, because I had the experience in my last few years at the CDC. I was at CDC for 14 and a half years. Well, in my last few years, I moved to a different part of CDC, and there I encountered resistance, and the resistance to having any work on racism being done at CDC, and if it belonged at CDC at all, it certainly didn't belong in our division. And the person who would clear my presentation said I needed to take that second point off my slide about unfair advantage. I had already talked about the disadvantage. I need to completely remove that second point. And the compromise we made was, well, he said, okay, you can keep it as long as you take the words unfairly off of those. So I could talk about disadvantage and advantage as long as I didn't characterize any of them as unfair. And his position made me understand that there are many people in this country who think that there is disadvantaged and normal. Right? Disadvantaged and normal. And that stance comes from us being ahistorical. Because those people who think that there's disadvantage and normal do not recognize that their normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. So I'm now going to share with you a second image, a story. I call it Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. This story was actually sparked by my experience as a medical student. So I was studying with some friends in my apartment, and we were studying long and hard, and it got late, and we got hungry, and I had no food in the apartment. So we decided to go into town to get something to eat. So we go into town, and we find a restaurant, we walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food and the food is served. And here we are eating. So that's not a very illuminating story yet. I imagine most of us have had this experience, okay? Right, you're like, oh, Camara. Okay, but as I sat there, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and that sign was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now I've piqued your curiosity. Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Well, let me tell you what the sign said. The sign said open. So now I know I've lost most of you. Recap. Here we are, sitting in a restaurant, eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open. If I had thought no more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that now, because of the hour, the restaurant was indeed closed, and that hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. And then I understood how racism structures open-closed signs in our society, that racism structures a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity, eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there is a system of, a two-sided sign going on, because it's difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except we got a little taste of that with Ebola, did we not? But those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who say, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism, it's actually an empowering thing. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act, so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, then you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside the restaurant with you. And you could say, why don't you open the restaurant again? There are hungry people outside. Let them come in. You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we can have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass food through the door or break the glass or try to tear down the sign. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat, because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. And I have actually had, and again, we don't have time here, and I don't think I'll even pause here right now. I have had a 3-hour conversation with a group of folks in Flint, Michigan about how could people born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of the sign, because there are many ways, and maybe we'll have some time during these next 2 days to have that kind of conversation. But for now, I'm going to carry on with my last image, which is built on a framework of understanding 3 levels of racism. Because when you try to figure out how does that two-sided sign turn into differences in the prevalence of and complications from knee, morbid arthritis in the knee, or how does it turn into asthma differences, or differences in obesity prevalence, or differences in cancer survival rates and the like. When you try to figure out how racism can turn into a health outcome, it's useful to think about institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized racism. So let me define each of these, give you examples of how they can impact health, and then illustrate them with my Gardener's Tale allegory. I am interested in this room, who has not heard the Gardener's Tale before? Okay, good. And so for those who have heard it, I want you all to listen with different ears to the nuances of the storytelling so that you can more confidently tell the story back. For the rest of you who haven't heard it before, just sit back and listen. But first, the definitions. I'm going to go through these very quickly because I'm looking at my clock. Institutionalized racism is the system, if you will, the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, which taken together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. So this is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator, because it's been institutionalized in our laws and customs and background norms. This is the kind of racism that often shows up as inherited disadvantage, or its reciprocal inherited advantage. We see it in terms of material conditions and in terms of access to power. So differential access by race to quality housing or equal educational opportunities or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. Differential access to medical facilities, including linguistic access. Differential access to a clean environment and the very well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations in communities of color. In terms of power, differential access to power as information, which could be health information or insurance information, as was pointed out in the video, or even information about our own histories. Differential access to resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources and knowing somebody on the board. And differential access to power as voice in government and media and the like. Now, sometimes people interrupt me there and they say, Dr. Jones, look at that first set of examples, housing, education, employment, income. Dr. Jones, isn't that what we call social class? Why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism, or are you really, really, really talking about social class? And that's a question that many of you might share. Let me answer that question first with the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there has been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, it was the taking of the land, and then the near genocide, And then the moving of survivors to reserve lands, reservations. And then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick them up and move them somewhere else. We have people who lived for centuries in Mexico who never crossed the border. The border crossed them, and they find themselves in New Mexico now, and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are being harassed. And then we have people, we have a long history of I guess, using the labor of people from other countries, like, you know, all the stigmatized labor of farm workers and the like now from the Americas, but, you know, the Chinese laborers who were brought here to build our railroads, unable by law to marry and unable by law to bring their families. In fact, let's think about Japanese people who were interned during World War II. And how we're worried about maybe people of Middle Eastern, North African, or Muslim looking or whatever might start to be interned now. And when you go back to people of African descent in this country, the initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people and our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors and their progeny for generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people go, oh, Dr. Jones, there you go talking about slavery, right? Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery, you know, was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865. And we're now in 2017, and so that was 152 years ago. So all else being equal, Dr. Jones, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase is all else being equal, and all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are present-day contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that and all of these other initial historical injustices. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized racism. So when somebody asks me, am I talking about social class or am I talking about racism? My response is that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. It's a very important aha, right? And I also need to say that I am concerned about poor white people and poor Hispanic people, poor black people, poor Indian people, poor Asian people. And so it is not a thing about are we going to do with racism or poverty. If this were a magic wand and I could eliminate income inequality today, boom, I'd use it. We'd be all equal. Now, some of you guys would not want that. You know, my husband and I disagree. But I would use that magic wand, and I would eliminate income inequality. But even if I did that, if I did it without addressing the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, the mechanisms of institutionalized racism, if I eliminated things and flattened things out today without addressing these systems that are deeply embedded in our society and were put in place to shunt different populations to different possibilities, then even if I made things equal today, within one generation, within 20 years, we would start to see a stratification by race again in terms of income. So this is not an either-or proposition, poverty or racism. This is a both and. And before I leave this, I also need to say that institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. And very often, institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. Lots of examples. I can't stay on any of these long, but police brutality, physician disrespect, a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because she or he thinks that that patient couldn't afford or wouldn't understand or wouldn't comply. Or it could even be very blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment, which are different elements of what some people call everyday racism, the microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect. Teacher devaluation, very important manifestation, because if a teacher looks at a young child and thinks that child can't learn, and puts them off in the ADD track, that child won't even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Like institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important to recognize at this level is that personally mediated racism can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I am defining on this slide from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Now, I do recognize that, as some of my colleagues who do anti-racism training have pointed out to me, that the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people walk around with is also internalized racism. I don't have it on this slide now because for a long time I didn't even understand how that could turn into adverse health outcomes. But if you have a question about that, we can talk about that more. Okay? I think it actually made some people vote against their own interests. But from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, self-evaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or go to that college or try to live in that neighborhood or get that job. The white man's ISIS Calder syndrome, that phraseology comes from my parents' generation. What it meant for people of color then, it still means for many of us today. So say, for example, I need a lawyer and I'm black. I might actually go seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if I'm sick, I might prefer a white doctor over a black doctor. In fact, if my water were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Resignation, helplessness, hopelessness turns to a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, turns into not registering to vote, not voting even if you are registered, and all of these things have health impacts. And really, internalized racism is about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that when you hear young high school students of color, and one of them's trying to be the valedictorian, and the friends are teasing her or him by saying, well, so-and-so is just trying to be white, we need to challenge that. Because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate these three levels of racism with my gardener's tale, which was also sparked by a real-life experience. And I warn you, I may go 2 minutes over. I'm looking at my clock, okay? So don't drag me off, please. So when my husband and we had been married about a year, and we were moving from New York back down to Baltimore. I was going to finish my PhD at Hopkins. So we bought our first freestanding house. Cute little house, big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. And we bought this house in October, which was not really the time to plant, But when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, ran out with our marigold seeds, going to decorate our porch. And then he came back in, he was like, oh, wow, Camara, some of the boxes have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. So let me go down to the gardening store and get some potting soil. So he goes down, he hauls back big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes. And then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds, and we put them in all of the boxes. And we water all of them. And then I'm not the gardener in the family, so at this point, I'm exhausted. I'm going to just sit back and be delighted. Well, 3 weeks later, when I'm walking out of my front door and looking at the flower boxes on my porch, I literally stopped in my tracks because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were full of tall, vigorous-looking plants. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old dirt that we had found in the boxes turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed in the poor, rocky soil just died. And even the strong seed planted in that poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And some of you guys are nodding, so you're like, maybe there's some gardeners here in the family. Maybe you've composted half of your garden. Maybe you have seen this image with your own real eyes. And the image, of course, is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take this image and I'm going to turn this into a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes a red seed, puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed in the poor, rocky soil. 3 weeks later in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed has sprouted. Strong red seed grows tall and vigorous. Weak red seed makes it at least halfway up. In that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies. Here comes a strong pink seed struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those 2 flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we interrupt the story there to say the first part of this story illustrates how institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil, you had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up and say, well, where would personally mediated racism be in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking over the red flowers thinking, oh, those red flowers are just beautiful. And then she looks at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not understanding or acknowledging that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And then here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzzz, into one of the pink flowers, and then bzzz, to another pink flower, and then bzzz, to this pink flower, and this pink flower's like, get away from me, bee, don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. That is an important intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So we do. And in the workshop, we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. If you want to set things right in this garden, what we need to do is to address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it makes it easier for the gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you keep separate boxes, then it means you have to enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich, fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious, so that in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, you will also address the internalized racism, because now pink flowers won't be looking over at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children, who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful, would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story is going to illustrate those 3 levels of racism and to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the institutionalized. Good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the institutionalized, and the other levels may take care of themselves. I'm going to, if I may just finish up this story, and then I know they're coming. May I have a total of 5 minutes extra? That gives me 2 more minutes. Two more. Very quickly. I want to say, I haven't raised the question yet, who's the gardener? Because after all, the gardener is the one with the power to decide, power to act, control of resources, which taken together are the elements of self-determination. Gardener includes government, it includes media, foundations, corporations, communities to the extent they have self-determination, but whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red, that's why she prefers red over pink, right? And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity. When she looks at her garden, thinks her garden is beautiful because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And so our challenge is what to do about the garden. Do we make the garden striped polka dotted fuchsia? Lots of questions that can come out of it. One question I was once asked is, Dr. Jones, why should the red flowers share their soil? I love that question. It showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism. that would be otherwise difficult. We're talking about racism between you and me. My answer to the question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers, it belongs to the whole garden. Another question, what if that's the original, what if it's not the original gardener? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are. And that great-great-great-great-grandchild always grew up looking at the flowers looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So very quickly, first of all, we need to make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. Then, how are we going to solve it? Well, we need to make those flower boxes transparent because we need to be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil. And finally, when we make those flower boxes transparent, we have to be crystal clear that the pink seed did not just go launch themselves in that poor rocky soil. So we need to talk about history and talk about how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink, that cultural racism, if you will, what in our context is white supremacist ideology, set up the whole situation. Because if we don't deal with that, my gardener's tale used to just all be about the quality of the soil. Maybe 2 years ago when I told it, it was just about that, right? But one day in the telling, I recognized that even if we were to compel the gardener to enrich that poor rocky soil today until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil, if she continues to prefer red over pink going forward, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So what is health equity? I just want to say that health equity is not an outcome, it's a process, it's assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people, and this is what I want you to take home from this. Achieving health equity, getting there, requires at least these three things: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources not equally but according to need. And then what's the relationship between health equity and health disparities? Health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. Finally, I want to leave you with an understanding of these three huge barriers to achieving health equity. I've mentioned two of them already before. We are narrowly focused on the individual in this nation, which means that even our sense of self-interest is very narrowly defined. It may not even extend to our cousins or our aunts and uncles. We have a limited sense of interdependence there, but for the grace of God go I, and we have a limited sense of collective efficacy. We think, what can I do as a physician, not what can we do as a collective. And when you are narrowly focused on the individual, systems and structures are either invisible or irrelevant. I mentioned the second one. We are ahistorical in this nation, thinking that the present is disconnected from the past and that the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage is happenstance. And finally, I didn't mention this yet, but the myth of meritocracy, the story that goes something like this: if you work hard, you'll make it. Now, I give you that most people who have made it have worked hard. Not everybody who has made it has worked hard, but most people who have made it have worked hard. But there are many, 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 many other people who are working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field. And when we deny racism and other systems of structured inequity which have established and are maintaining that uneven playing field, then we are endorsing the myth of meritocracy. And you deny racism in two ways. You can deny racism by saying, I don't think racism exists. Or you can deny racism in your silence. Because when we are in the context of the widespread denial that racism is alive and well and continues to have profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation, and you don't say the word racism, it's good to talk about unconscious and conscious bias. It's good to talk about cultural competency. It's good to talk about discrimination. All of those things are good things to talk about. But unless you say the word racism, then you are in denial of racism. So finally, I invite all of us to join in the national campaign against racism that I actually launched during my presidency of the American Public Health Association with 3 tasks: to name racism, say the whole word, racism, that's it. Ask, how is racism operating here? I didn't give you tools that, but maybe in the 2 days we'll get there. But that's looking at structures, policies, practices, norms and values, the elements of decision making. And then finally, we need to organize and strategize to act. And we here in Movement is Life, in this caucus, have the power and the reach and the will to do that. Thank you very much for your attention.